Welcome, and thank you for tuning in to A Sound Constitution on CHLY 101.7 FM from Nanaimo with your hosts Max, Kelly, Carla, Harris, Cassandra, and Samantha. We are third-year Bachelor of Science in Nursing students at Vancouver Island University. We are working to demystify health issues affecting our community by bringing you evidence-based information about healthcare. This information is for educational purposes only and does not replace the advice of your primary healthcare provider. We would like to start our show by acknowledging that we are on the unceded territory of the Nanaimo people with a broadcasting range that overlaps the Coatson and Sliammon territories. This acknowledgement is done with gratitude to the Nanaimo people and with the intention to increase awareness about truth and reconciliation processes and efforts on Vancouver Island.
Thank you for joining A Sound Constitution at CHLY 101.7 FM for this week's episode. What comes to mind when you hear the word health? Is it being free from any kind of illnesses? Is it checking your blood pressure and sugar levels yearly to ensure that you don't have high blood pressure or diabetes? The World Health Organization, WHO, defines health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not just merely the absence of disease. In modern-day society, health is not strictly focused on visible physical illnesses such as cancer or asthma. As we discover and learn more about ourselves and recognize the many different aspects of health, mental wellness becomes a more prevalent issue. Topics such as depression, anxiety, PTSD are trending all over social media, and they're becoming the focus of everyday conversation. But why is mental health so important, and how can we support our mental wellness? I'm your host, Kelly. Along with my two co-hosts, Max and Harris, we're going to be talking about the importance of mental health, resilience, and what you can do to improve your mental wellness and support others.
For the first portion of today's episode, Harris had a conversation with Todd Ralph, him, about the mental health stressors facing university students nowadays, as well as some of the supports available to them. Todd is a student wellness promoter with VIU's Talk to Me program, and those of us who know Todd know he is one of the most passionate advocates for mental health support that you're ever likely to meet. Without further ado, I'll turn the airwaves over to Harris and Todd here on A Sound Constitution on CHLY 101.7 FM.
Thanks for joining us on the show, Todd. So before we get into these questions, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, thank you for having me. Yeah, I just want to acknowledge that I'm joining this call from the traditional unceded territory of the Coatson tribes. I am currently in my third year of the nursing program at VIU. And growing up, I used to play a lot of things like soccer and sports, and I like playing a lot of instruments as well. I was a band geek, so I played guitar and I was in choir.
That sounds great. No, it sounds like you definitely have a tenured history with growing up on the island. So just to get a little bit into things, so you're currently involved with the Talk to Me program. Can you tell the listeners a little bit about the program and how you got involved?
Yeah, so the Talk to Me program is designed to create connections among VIU students and to increase the students' senses of belonging and to decrease those feelings of loneliness. We aim to put on events and we try and offer support and resources to students. And I just want to mention that this is not just a group, but it's also a campaign. It's a campaign that aims to create more connected VIU campus culture. Normally, we do things in person, but I joined this year and we transitioned to doing things online through Zoom, as most students are well aware, having their classes transition. And it has had difficulties doing that transition, but Before the pandemic, we would promote the program and campaign by handing out these talk to me buttons. And wearing that button could mean that you want to meet more people on campus and you're okay if people you don't know start a conversation with them. As we've transitioned to COVID, we're promoting virtual talk to me buttons to try and replicate that kind of notion. And I first got introduced to the Talk to Me program last year in my second year of the nursing program. As part of the curriculum, one of our days was spent assisting with kind of the VIU mental health days, and I chose to be at the mental health screening table. So I had the opportunity to work with the counselors during that screening process, and that's where I met Sarah Lamar, who I had discussions with about kind of my interests in mental health and kind of my experiences with it. And she initially offered the position and mentioned the Talk to Me program, but unfortunately, I was unable to join at that time because of my other obligations. But she reached out again to me this year to see if my interest was still there. And that's when I applied for this position. I do have a strong passion for mental health myself, and I'm sure many of the listeners here have experienced loss in one form or another. I know myself, I lost one of my good friends to suicide a few years back, and just kind of not even realizing that they were going through their own struggles at the time, and just kind of dealing with mental health as a male growing up and not really having an avenue. I really want to advocate for kind of more talk between men and around these topics. So that's why I joined the Talk to Me program in hopes of taking a step towards that direction.
It's fantastic, especially having a community in which men can talk about mental health. Definitely can be almost a watershed moment where people can really start to open up about their feelings and have these real conversations. So as a student and a volunteer with the Talk to Me program, what are some of the mental health challenges faced by students that you've noticed?
I mean, we're all feeling kind of the Zoom burnout being in classes, and it's kind of an unprecedented time that we're having to transition. I know social isolation is kind of a big issue that we're all kind of facing. And we are a connected community. That's part of how we thrive and how we exist. So having these things kind of diminished and taken away from us has negative impacts on our well-being and mental health. And so a lot of students have kind of expressed that through different events that we're having. They're thankful that we're putting on these events, but also like other peers in the program, we're all kind of feeling that effect. And it's definitely a really difficult transition.
Absolutely. Currently, we're experiencing an unprecedented time with the pandemic and what we're living through collectively as a group. How have some of the things that you've seen in the Talk to Me program supported resiliency for students during this difficult time?
So yeah, because of the shift into an online environment, we've had to try and adapt the program to an online format. We've been working hard to do this. We've been running a number of different Talk to Me online connection events to help students feel less isolated during this time. And we have also been working hard with the VIU Thrive team throughout the year to offer events and campaigns aimed at promoting wellness and resiliency among students. For example, right now we have a campaign for Nutrition Month, which seeks to educate students around the importance of healthy nutrition to mental health and academic success.
That sounds incredible. Yeah, it definitely seems like there's no shortage of programs that you guys are running. And it's really nice to see that connection between programs such as this and the student populace, especially as we're all undergoing this unprecedented time. So what are some of the resources you'd recommend for students to access if they're experiencing mental health related issues or a need for additional support with their resiliency?
I would encourage all students to follow us on social media. So there's both the VIU Thrive team, which is on Facebook. It's at Thrive VIU. And they also have an Instagram, which is at VIU Thrive, just switched around there. And that way you can stay up to date on all the mental health and wellness programming that VIU is offering. Another thing I'd encourage students to do is to get involved with all the great online connection events that the Talk to Me program and the other groups on campus, like the Fun at VIU team hosts to help students feel connected. And if students are looking for additional supports outside of these VIU events, I would encourage them to access the VIU counseling services that are still available. I know right now you can't go in person, but they do still have phone services available as well as Zoom appointments available. That phone number is 250-740-6416. On top of this, students can also access free 24/7 counseling services through a government-run program. It's called Here to Talk. Students can visit heretotalk.ca if they want to find out more information on this resource. And if someone is needing immediate support, I encourage them to call the Vancouver Island Crisis Line. And just a reminder, their number is 1-888-494-3888.
Definitely a lot of resources that people can reach out to if they're feeling like they need a little bit of extra help. Before we wrap up, is there any plugs for the Talk to Me program or any remarks you'd like to add?
Yeah, again, join us on social media as well as Thrive. Our program works closely together and we have similar goals of increasing student wellness. And I really do believe that the Talk to Me program does create those meaningful connections among the VIU students. And this is something we really need right now. And this connection has never been more important than now. I encourage anyone listening to follow both the Talk to Me and Thrive programs on Facebook. Try and come out to our events. I know it's getting close to exam time, so everyone might be hesitant, but we really do aim to increase mental health, and we're going to be giving kind of tips on our event next week, March 18th. This is from 4 to 5 p.m. And this is going to be tips on surviving exam week, so we can help out with that stress. Participate in our campaigns, and hopefully we can help build a campus culture of mental health and well-being together.
That sounds fantastic. Thanks, Todd. Thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thank you for having me.
That was Harris's interview with Todd Ralph, a student wellness promoter with VIU's Talk to Me program, a support system in place to encourage good mental health and social connection among university students. As you heard Todd mention, the Talk to Me program is hosting an online event today, offering students tips on surviving our upcoming exam week. That's today, March 18th at 4 p.m. So be sure to head over to the Talk to Me Facebook page for more information. For the next segment of today's episode, Kelly was able to connect with VIU's own Lee Blaney. Lee is a nursing instructor specializing in mental health and a prolific researcher and presenter in the areas of crisis intervention and critical incident stress management.
For those of you who are tuning in just now, thank you for joining A Sound Constitution at CHLY 101.7 FM. I'm your host, Kelly. We're pleased to have Lee Blaney, a nursing professor in the Bachelor of Science at VIU, joining us today. Thank you for being here today, Lee. Can you start by telling us a little bit about yourself?
Well, my background is as a mental health addictions nurse for many, many years. I have worked at VIU in the nursing program for about 20 years now, and I taught across the program, but currently I teach in second year, doing a health and healing course with a mental health focus. And I have students, I'm a clinical instructor with students in mental health addictions. I'm also a researcher. I look at things like critical incident stress management in high-risk professions, mental health, occupational mental health, and currently spending a lot of time looking at resilience, again in high-risk professions, such as first responder, fire, police, paramedic, and nursing. We have a current project underway looking at resilience in nurses.
Well, it sounds like you have a area of focus and you basically branched out in that specific area and then touching on a lot of aspects like mental health, resilience, and different stuff. So as you were mentioning in your self-introduction, you work as a clinical instructor in the hospital on the psych unit, I'm assuming, and then a researcher on mental health. So I'm guessing you have a lot of experience dealing with frontline workers. So you were mentioning firefighters, nurses as well. So in the past, what are some of the challenges faced by frontline workers that you've noticed?
Well, I'd like to focus on the mental health of frontline workers and some of the challenges first responders such as fire, paramedic, nursing, and police face. First off, there's within British Columbia, within Canada, actually globally, there's a significant lack of resource for treatment of mental illness. There's a lack of services that prevent mental health crises. There's a focus on responding to mental health crises rather than looking at what are the contributors to those crises, and they're not necessarily what society thinks they are. We also lack psychiatrists, and there's an unwillingness societally and within healthcare systems to look at alternative models of care, such as nurse-led psychiatric teams, primary care models, and team-based healthcare. Secondly, there's an unwillingness of our governments, federally, provincially, locally, to look at comprehensive management of mental illness. We already have chronic disease management models for things like diabetes and for cardiac care, but no comprehensive programs in our health authorities. I'm thinking of something like a model called the 4 Pillars, which was implemented in Vancouver in, I think, 1983 or 86. Those types of programs are coordinated and funded across government sources or structures. In Nanaimo, for example, we recently acquired an RCMP mental health liaison officer. Interestingly, though, this position is funded by the RCMP, a justice and enforcement agency, and it's only one position. This, despite historical and current evidence that mental health and police liaison teams funded not solely by enforcement, but by health dollars, are extremely effective in decreasing encounters with enforcement, increasing compliance with treatment, and decreasing the costs associated with having enforcement agencies responding to mental health calls. With the health agencies simply being the recipients of those mentally ill individuals. So the police scoop and they drop them at the hospital. And the mental health and addictions is actually our health and social problems, reflecting gaps in the social determinants of health. And they are generally not law enforcement problems. And then thirdly, some of the challenges faced by first responders in sort of mental health areas is the ongoing stigmatization of people with mental health or addiction issues. Again, these are health and social issues that are perpetuated by citizens just like you and me, ordinary people who choose to see homelessness, mental illness, addiction as poor choices that people make, poor choices made by other people, hence they must be criminals. And as a society, we choose not to understand that mental illness, including addiction, are brain diseases that cause changes in the structure, function, and chemistry of the brain. These are treatable brain conditions, but because they're complex disorders that often affect behavior, society chooses to solely look at behavior and look for simple solutions for the behavior, and those behaviors often go against social norms, hence they become a police problem. And finally, one of the biggest challenges that I see is in shifting the perspective of the general population, you, me, and the overall social networks that make up our citizenry, to viewing mental health and addiction, changing it from looking at mental health and addictions as problems to be solved by enforcement, to understanding mental illnesses as complex brain disorders that require really complex, interdependent health, social, and safety solutions.
Thank you for that answer, Lee. And over the years, do you think with education provided everywhere, we as a society are getting better with reducing discrimination and stigma towards people suffering from mental illnesses or even people working in the field of mental health?
Well, I think that within the field of mental health, yes, we have continued to evolve evidence-informed interventions, treatment, prevention programs. Within general society, it is so incremental that I hardly see any change in people's attitudes, and certainly a willingness by society to go to the very negative outcomes and the extreme outcomes. I read a statistic one time that said that 10% of our population are criminals. General population are criminals. And yet, when I think about some of the services in Nanaimo, the supportive housing on Terminal Avenue and Labiola Road, it seems as if everyone that's living within those supportive housing have been targeted as criminals, when in fact, when we look closely at that, when we actually look at it, we don't have to look closely, we just have to look at it. There's less than 10% of those people that are criminal in nature. So I think we really need, as a society, to continue to work on educating and shifting that perspective and being willing to learn about a different perspective.
Yeah, definitely. I do agree in terms of education and empowering those who are dealing with mental illnesses. It's hard as it is to, handle a disease, and then let alone the sort of stigma that comes towards them as a society. So in terms of empowering, on the topic of empowering, I guess, I understand that some of your research work are sort of in the field of resiliency. Can you tell us a little bit about how resilience relates to mental health and individual well-being?
This will be a long-winded response as well, but it also ties in with your previous question about the challenges facing frontline workers. As you will recall, much of my work in health promotion has been with firefighters. And I started out working with fire rescue personnel, doing critical incident stress management, education, and interventions such as stress debriefings. But when I asked firefighters locally, nationally, and internationally what helped them cope with the inherent stressors of the job, the term resilience kept coming up. And yet there was no common understanding of that terminology, of what it actually meant. When I was doing some graduate studies, I found, and looking into resilience, I found 52 different definitions of resilience. And there were lots of times that the word resilience was interchanged with the word resiliency, and they actually are two different concepts. But to get back to your question, there's clear evidence that the more resilient people are, the better their mental health is. There's a number of components to resilience that can be changed and adapted and built upon. And in building upon those, we build a bigger toolbox of strategies, of assets to bring forward in times of adversity. And so having the capacity to learn about new strategies, I suppose, develop new assets, but also to have the motivation to pull those forward during times of adversity has been an ongoing challenge for people. They feel downtrodden, they feel depressed and sad and amotivated to do things. And so one of the biggest challenges when we are feeling less mentally healthy is to reach in and pull out some of those tools. But there is clear evidence that the more tools in the toolbox, the better our resilience, the higher our resilience scores, and the better our mental health and well-being.
Definitely. And this is something that we should be educating for people who are working in the mental health field. We should be educating our patients on resiliency. And then we as a society, especially during the difficult times of COVID-19, needs to learn about resiliency and how we can best thrive. Being physically isolated from each other and dealing with job loss and different things like that. While we're on the topic about COVID-19, in the difficult times of the pandemic, what are some of the things that you've seen that sort of support resiliency and mental well-being of frontline workers?
We use a 6-component model of resilience, which is pretty complex, but allows a lot of different entry points to building or accessing resilience. And I'll talk about these individually, but they are things like relationships, personal resources, meaning-making, culture, leadership, and knowledge. So what we mean by relationships overall in sort of the resilience field is not just social support, not just having social support, but having really solid relationships that appear right now to have been rocked somewhat by our isolation and the need for distancing due to COVID. Those relationships are actually pretty solid. They require effort and means to keep going and to keep connected with people, but they go beyond that simple social face-to-face connection. We need to seek out, in times of COVID in particular, those relationships or seek out ways to maintain and build those relationships in new forms and formats as we navigate this ever-changing COVID. And we've seen things in families where grandparents are unable to see grandchildren it's been over a year now for some of them. But they do things like FaceTime and Zoom and various telephone types of connections. There are online dinners and games and celebrations that happen. Now, they're not ideal, and we would all prefer to have face-to-face. But having those relationships and maintaining and putting effort into maintaining those relationships is a key way of building and certainly maintaining our relationships, our resilience. As far as personal resources go, we have to activate and be mindful about activating these personal resources, such as exercise, mindfulness exercises, monitoring what we put into our bodies, fluids and foods and that kind of thing, getting back to some of our beloved hobbies or trying new hobbies now that we have some time when we away from often the work site or more time when we're not always so busy with our work-related things. So building up those personal resources or reactivating those personal resources. As far as meaning making goes, recognizing that anybody, but certainly frontline workers, moral distress can and does occur, and particularly for first responders when we have dual public health emergencies of COVID and the opioid crisis. So we do experience moral distress, but we can move beyond distress to moral resilience as part of cultivating our overall resilience. We can reach out to others, either at work or in our neighborhoods, such as shopping for our isolated seniors, even window visits with our neighbors, with family members. These are all things that sort of making meaning within a situation that we don't necessarily have control over and we don't like, but we can find some meaning and continue to build relationships, build personal resources, and finding some creative ways of connecting with the world. Culture is another component. So at work, we can create intentionally and thoughtfully create a culture of positivity. We're sometimes feeling overwhelmed, certainly for nursing, and I know with other first responders as well. It feels like it's an overwhelming experience that we're having. And we can choose to look at it as overwhelm, or we can choose to look at it as a societal challenge that we're all facing at the same time, and that we do have strengths and we do have capacities to move beyond that. So recognizing what our collective strengths are and the diversity of strengths that we bring, each one of us brings to our job. Within community, recognizing and calling out bad behaviors such as racism, and actively contributing to a Canadian culture that values each one of us. Within the component of leadership, I recently read an article that said that for nurses, during COVID, quote, leadership did not come from elected officials or spiritual guides, but from a group that is underpaid, overworked, and considered secondary, even in their own workplaces. As so many others have dropped the ball, nurses have worked tirelessly out of the spotlight to save lives, end quote. That quiet attitude of get to it for nurses while constantly caring about and caring for very ill and dying people is the epitome of leadership. It's not big L leadership, it's small L, it's the day-to-day, minute-to-minute showing up of first responders. And that aspect of leadership, that service to community and leading in the service to community is a significant component to building resilience. So being proud of what we do, and again, rather than framing this as an overwhelming situation, recognizing that there are horrifically bad things that happen within it, but that I'm still showing up every day and I'm bringing my personality, I'm bringing my energy, and I'm bringing my caring into the job that I do. And then finally, knowledge as a component. During COVID, especially, we need to constantly seek out reliable sources of knowledge. Not Facebook or Twitter or whatever they're calling those things these days, but legitimate evidence-based sources such as the BC Centre for Disease Control or Health Canada. But also recognizing that we are all learning as we go with this virus. And we need to be prepared to, based on evidence, switch gears or pivot, as they call it these days, in response to evolving knowledge. really pushing through some of the negative chatter that goes on, and really looking at what are the facts related to COVID.
Thank you, Lee. It's amazing that you're talking about all different kinds of resources, like the personal resources you're mentioning, little things, having a support network, and also knowledge. I think a lot of it for us to recognize, especially during the pandemic, is it's the little things in life that matters. And then they come up together, they join together to help us become stronger, to help us overcome the sort of, I guess, traumatic event that's going on, which is COVID-19, sadly. It's wonderful. What you're saying is wonderful. It's very detailed, and I really, really enjoyed our conversation. Is there anything you'd like to share with our listeners today? Anything else you wish to add?
I think just to keep in mind that society and human beings are resilient, and that resilience is the most common outcome following adversity. And that's any adversity. That's in any age, any population, any group, anywhere in the world. Resilience is the most common outcome following adversity. And we need to acknowledge how tough the pandemic is, but also recognize that we're coming through a very challenging year on many levels for society and for individuals. And that key phrase of coming through should be a talisman that we carry with us. There is a process of resilience that has been emerging societally, worldwide, but also in individuals. Each of us, along with grief, anger, loneliness, human beings are strong and adaptive, and we will come through this and many other challenges to our health and social systems.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lee. For those of you who are tuning in right just now, thank you for joining us on Constitution at CHLY 101.7 FM. And thank you, Lee, again for joining us today.
Thanks, Kelly. It was great.
That concludes Kelly's interview with Lee Blaney, a nursing instructor at VIU specializing in mental health and research around resilience in first responders. We here at A Sound Constitution would like to thank Lee for taking the time to speak with us. She's a brilliant researcher, and any VIU nursing student who's been through Lee's class can attest to the fact that she knows her stuff inside and out. Thank you, Lee.
Next, we're going to play you part of a TED Talk by Heather Walkush, a psychotherapist and virtual learning expert with a focus on resilience and mental health wellness. This segment discusses what we as a society can do to support those suffering from mental illnesses, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic.
It's waking up on the floor of a cold prison cell and having no idea how you got there. It's hiding in the bathroom at work because you're shaking again, and if anybody sees you, you're going to lose your job. And it's that little girl who used to be so sweet that now she's punching the other kids at school. It's mental injury in this pandemic, a social fabric torn asunder. It's hard to feel stable when the world has been collapsed at your feet. But it's really important to take concrete steps to protect our mental health, both on an individual level and also on a societal level. And so I'd like to share with you my 10 points. The first of which is to take stock. Now, even before the pandemic, roughly 1 billion people were estimated to be suffering from mental health issues. And of course, that leads to corresponding issues of poverty, criminalization, discrimination. But the pandemic cracked open the facade of mental health and exposed the insufficiencies and injustices that have been there. And of course, also rates of mental illness have increased during the pandemic. The suicide rate has increased across the board, and in fact, it's being called a shadow pandemic. But in the same way that we need to take stock on a societal level, it's also important to take stock on a personal level. For me, I can say, oh man, my burnout is back. And it has brought a friend, insomnia. It's 2:00 in the morning, staring down the barrel of my alarm clock, knowing that I have to wake up in a couple of hours, but I can't sleep. It's when the colors of the rainbow turn to black and white, which leads to point 2, and that is to get context. Now, In my family, we have a long lineage of trauma and an equally long history of denying it. When my mother was a little girl in the Great Depression, her father killed himself under the weight of economic ruin. But her bereavement soon turned to horror under the hands of the man that her mother went on to marry. Incredible abuse that happened behind closed doors for over 10 years. Everybody was in denial about it. My mother went on to have profound psychological problems, and I took care of her. And 60 years later, I still can't sleep. In the same way that we need to look at the deeper context, however, of our personal challenges, we also need to look at societal challenges. Now, under the pandemic, alcoholism, child abuse, domestic violence have increased across the board, but they are seen as individual trends rather than very clear signs of collective trauma. A societal failure in dealing with mental injury. And of course, people of color and those of marginalized gender identities face more discrimination in the mental health system. It's waking up on a cold prison cell and having no idea how you got there. It's your black skin. It is the post-traumatic stress that you got from multiple military tours to Afghanistan. It's being triggered by watching the murder of George Floyd on television and the voices that told you to take that rock and break that window. And it's the fact that when the police found you, you were taken to prison rather than to get the mental health care support that you clearly need and deserve. So then the question comes, well, where is the money? This is number 3, follow the money. It's amazing because on average, countries spend only 2% of their health budgets on mental health. That is nothing. That is crazy. For example, in the United States, a person with a mental health challenge is 10 times more likely to end up in prison or jail rather than in a facility in which they are getting care. But meanwhile, of course, during the pandemic, billionaires have become even richer as our social services have been cut. It is hard to keep your personal balance in a world that's so imbalanced, but we must. And that leads to connecting the dots. Now, social services have decreased, jobs have decreased during the pandemic. Alcoholism, domestic violence have increased. It is to be expected that child abuse has also increased. And all of this suffering that is completely unnecessary and that clearly is going to go on and have implications for generations. Individuals often, however, are blamed rather than seeing this as a systemic problem. But if we don't acknowledge that, then we can't fix the structures that created them. In my mother's case, after so many years of vicious abuse, she was called crazy. She was ostracized, institutionalized, over-medicated. And of course, she became suicidal again and again. I grew up really fast. But these echoes of injury do not have to continue. Now, one way that we can change this path is to redefine experts. People with lived experience and people who are actually service users should be involved in designing the programs that are for healing. In this capacity, the World Health Organization obviously has done so much great work, and its quality rights program is fantastic in terms of combining human rights with mental health in the same way Grand Challenges Canada is amazing regarding, innovation and impact tech and humanitarian issues. When the whole world has crashed and burned at your feet and splintered into 1,000 pieces, it is that crystalline moment of brutal honesty, yet impossible beauty when you realize that you've got the opportunity, if not the responsibility, to pick up those pieces and put them back together in a way that's even better, a way that is more just and more humane and more inclusive and ultimately more sustainable. Thank you.
That was Heather Walkush, a psychotherapist and a virtual learning expert, sharing her views and beliefs about mental health and providing us with a to-do list with how members of the society can support each other to counteract mental illnesses. 2020 Grussetto. For those of you who are just tuning in, thank you for joining us at CHLY 101.7 FM. I'm Kelly, and I'm here with my two co-hosts, Max and Harris. So the TED Talk we just played shared a lot of general ideas on what we need to do to counteract the increasing rates of mental illness, such as redefine experts, go global, and follow money. Now, these ideas, while great, can be a bit too broad for people to understand. So we're here to talk a bit more about the specific ways people can do to improve their mental health and resilience. According to Mayo Clinic, self-care is a very important factor when it comes to coping with hardships and thriving. So Max, would you like to talk a bit more about what you do for self-care?
Sure, Kelly. Thank you for the opportunity. I really think when it comes to self-care, there has to be an emphasis on self. The approach has to be tailored to each individual. What works for me might not work for you, might not work for Harris. So you have to find what you love and find a way to squeeze it into your busy schedule. It's difficult nowadays, particularly during the COVID pandemic, with so many recreational facilities closed down or, limited operations. A lot of people aren't able to engage in the activities that they used to for recreation or relaxation. I'm kind of fortunate in this regard because my secret weapon against fatigue and building resilience is I like to go to the duck pond. I can often be found at Bowen Park here in Nanaimo, and thankfully the duck pond has remained open and populated during the pandemic. So I can't really explain it. I find something really relaxing about watching ducks and geese and just hanging out with some greenery surrounding you and a little bit of nature in the middle of the city. I find it's a great way to stave off the blues and kind of get revitalized for whatever you have to do next.
Yeah, thank you, Max. And Harris, would you like to talk a bit more about what you do for self-care?
Yeah, absolutely. For myself, I tend to actually, I'm fortunate as well to be living on Vancouver Island that I can isolate myself. How I do that is usually just by going on long hikes. And with long hikes, there's usually not too many people around. And this allows me to reflect and kind of decompress, basically just the fatigue that I feel from this pandemic or other stressors that may be in my life. It just allows me to reflect. Other things that I do for self-care is I like to engage in playing music or listening to music. Sometimes just taking a moment and just allowing yourself to reflect and actually just kind of almost performing a bit of a meditation allows me to ground myself and take care of myself.
Thank you, Harris. And yeah, just a little bit of myself as well. I read a lot in terms of just different ways to de-stress. And I know for speaking for other people who are more physically active, they might like to do things like dancing or jogging, engaging in physical activities. So what I'm hearing from the three of us is that self-care, like Max said, is very individualistic. We all have our different ways to deal with stress, anxiety, and different things that come on during life, and especially during the pandemic. It's very important to have an open mind. It's important to figure out what you truly want through experiencing different kind of activities and then find out what really works for you. And I just want to say that even though it's called self-care, it may sound like it's something that you have to do on your own because it's self-care, but that's not really the case. Having a support network is also very important as well. Max, would you like to share a bit more your definition or your experience with support networks?
Sure. Again, I think this is something that's different for each person. Some people are more social than others, and they really need, close friends, family, their partner, their roommate, whoever it may be there for them when they need someone to be there for them. Other people get a bit more drained by social contact or business contact and might feel a need instead to get away from kind of that noise level and just spend some time alone. It's difficult to define a support network for each person, but I would argue that everybody needs somebody sometimes, like the song says, and it's important to keep in touch with, your closest one or two at the very least, so that when you do feel that need to reach out, even if it's rare, that you do have someone available to speak with, and they most likely need you as much as you might need them.
I do agree, and I'm just remembering an old say in Chinese. If we directly translate from Mandarin to English, it goes something like, "A close neighbor is better than a family from far away." So it's important to keep in mind that those who are close to you physically are, some point you have to sort of take a strong hold on, and those are the people that can support you through difficult times, whether it's an illness, a loss of a family member, or even just someone that you can go on a walk with. It's important to share and to express your feelings through difficult times, and during the pandemic where we are physically apart from each other. And it's also important to remember that even though physically we're apart, mentally we're, and sort of emotionally we are very close because we're going through this together. Harris, do you want to talk a bit more about your definition or experience with support networks?
Yeah, I think Max did a great job of defining support networks, but I think for myself, I can talk a little bit about what I do for support networks. We're very much in a digital age, so I definitely use the internet quite a bit to connect with family and friends located around different parts of the globe. That's been a really big source of comfort, especially as my family's back in Saskatchewan. And so I talk to them on the phone, or I'll video chat with them, or my nieces and nephews. Other things that I've been able to do using an online medium is I've actually played board games online with my friends, and it's kind of allowed us to connect together. And yeah, it's just been really nice to kind of have that support network. I'm fortunate enough to be living with my partner, as well as having a pet. Everybody knows the embrace of a pet can really help you kind of decompress and calm yourself down. And so sometimes it's the pets that are the biggest source of therapy for us. And lastly, but not least, is I actually reach out to a counselor and use that as a resource here on VIU. I use the counseling services there, and it's been a great source of routine, but also checking in and identifying my own struggles throughout this pandemic. And I think it's been fantastic for myself.
Yeah, and I totally get where you're coming from with the pet thing. Max was talking about ducks, and you're talking about your pet, and I can understand the importance of animal therapy. And I think, based on my previous interview with Lee Blaney, I think she would agree as well. Just having that physical touch, I guess the fluffiness, it really makes you happy. So I like to talk a bit more about resiliency. It's a lot of people think of resilience is, being able to encounter some difficult trauma and not be impacted by it. But actually, resilience is the ability to come out of hardships and learn from experience, and thinking about how you've coped with hardships from the past and be able to sort of recover from it. Would you like to talk a bit more about resilience and what that means to you?
Yeah, I think resiliency it spans among everybody very differently, and different generations will have resiliency in different ways. I think it's also a byproduct of how we're brought up. We learn coping strategies from our parents, very much so, or who's been instrumental in our life and development. For myself, my coping strategies are definitely derived from my parents. And I think with the way I am resilient is I focus on tasks at hand and keeping moving. I think keeping busy is always a source of comfort, and it gives you a sense of routine. And so that was something that I very much drew from my parents. Currently, right now, for resiliency during this pandemic, I think what I do is I create a sense of routine. I write out my day, I make a checklist, I go through certain things that allow me to have certain measurements of how I'm accomplishing my goals throughout the day. And this gives me a sense of satisfaction. And having that satisfaction allows me to feel accomplished in that day and make me feel like there's a sense of normalcy. And I think for other people, their resiliency might be different. But for myself, it's driven based off of having different activities or a source of routine that allows me to feel comfortable.
Yeah, thank you, Harris. And I do agree. It's important to keep yourself busy, especially during the pandemic. how I deal with resiliency, a lot of it is based on being proactive and being forgiving. We now live in a society that's very fast paced. A lot of it's just, we need to get this done, we need to get going. But it's also important to understand that it takes time to recover from trauma, whether it's trauma with life or at workplace or with relationship. It takes a lot of time. It doesn't matter how many times you've experienced it, it will still take a long period of time for you to recover. And it's important to keep in mind that some people go at their own pace. So it's important not to beat yourself up as you're struggling through and dealing with whatever you've been experiencing. Being proactive, I guess for me, is a lot of is getting up in the morning and then, like Harris said, sort of have a list of things that you need to get done and start working on them. That way, in the end of the day, you'll feel like you've actually accomplished something, and then that helps to cope with the trauma that you've experienced in the past, that sort of negative feeling, or the feeling that, you've been made a mistake or you've been destroyed by whatever life has thrown at you. So Max, would you like to share a bit about your experience with resiliency?
I may have a different take on resiliency based on the fact that I'm a bit older than most of the other VIU students, almost twice as old, in fact. To me, resiliency, it starts with a mindset and a work ethic. I mean, life is hard, so you have to be hard. And that might not sound particularly constructive or progressive, but it is what has worked for me. You can think of it as a muscle. The more you work it out, the stronger it gets. It's important not to overburden yourself to an unrealistic degree to the point that you're doomed to fail. I guess in nursing school, we would call it building capacity. And I think a lot of people, when they've gone through a traumatic event or a really difficult period in their life, they may get wrapped up in the traumatic effects of it, the negative after effects, and how it's weakened them, when they could perhaps be better served by focusing a bit more on the strengths that these hard times can build in people, the resilience it can help to generate. Now, I'm not saying we should all spend our lives seeking out traumatic situations. That's not going to work out in the long term, but it is important, I guess, from sort of a balanced perspective to not get too wrapped up in the victimizing aspects of trauma and how weakened we may feel, but to recognize that it can build positive character aspects as well.
I agree. It's important to look at the glass as, half full rather than half empty. We can, even though it might be a traumatic event, we definitely might be able to generate something positive out of it and see it as a learning experience. I just want to say thank you both for, sharing your own experience with resiliency, mental health, and self-care. For those of you tuning in, thank you for joining us at CHLY 101.7 FM.
This concludes another episode of A Sound Constitution. As Kelly mentioned, we'd like to thank you, our listeners, for tuning in, and we'd also like to thank our CHLY field guide, our community health nursing practice instructor, and today's guests, Todd Ralph and Lee Blaney. As a reminder, the health discussions here on A Sound Constitution are for entertainment and educational purposes only and do not replace the advice of your primary healthcare provider. As always, we welcome your feedback on this episode or any other, and we encourage you to reach out to us via our Facebook, YouTube, or Instagram pages. On behalf of Kelly, Harris, and the entire Sound Constitution team, this is Max, signing off on CHLY 101.7 FM.